Hello, everybody. This is Bob Allen. I'm with Orange County chapter of California Native Plant Society. My buddy Fred Roberts is here. Fred is a local botanist here in Southern California. We're both heavily involved in CNPS. Fred is a rare plant botanist for, I think, most of the chapters in the state, it seems. He's a private consulting botanist in Southern California. I've known Fred since we were in junior high. We go way back. And he's going to talk to us tonight about projects he's done at Crystal Cove State Park. And I'd like Fred to go ahead and tell you more detail. Take it away, Freddie.
All right. Should I go ahead and just start the screen, or am I still giving a little introduction on myself here?
If you would like to do a little more introduction. By the way, folks, This
Okay.
is pretty informal. If you have questions, you can put them in chat. Fred's going to go ahead and take over.
Okay. Apparently some of the
Okay.
folks I was communicating with, they tried the rebooting the thing and it seemed to work. Okay, so just like Bob had said, most of you know who I am probably by now. And you also know that I'm a rare plant consultant along with all the other things I do. And I've had the opportunity to do about 24,000 acres of plant surveys with the Irvine Ranch Conservancy. And that's where this Crystal Cove project actually came about. And to figure out where, I'm actually going to go ahead and start putting something up while I'm talking, because we've had a little trouble getting going on this thing, and I just want to make sure we're actually doing it. So I'm going to share my screen, find my Keynote program, which is this one, I think. Okay. And I lost it. Okay, never mind. There we go. All right. So I'm hoping everyone can see me or see the program who is trying to get into this. Just so you know, because there's going to be there's going to be moments when there's going to be a dog barking in the background. So I figured you might as well meet Pippin. You've got the opportunity, and he's also, because this picture shows a very nice blue sky. Most of you haven't seen that for a while. And but it's starting to get that way again. Pippin helps me with a number of different things, but he's not a very good botany companion. So this program tonight, we're going to be talking about Crystal Cove State Park and looking at a season of plant surveys I did with actually a year of plant surveys I did with the Irvine Ranch Conservancy in 2017 at Crystal Cove State Park. Oh, good. Looks like we've got a few more people managed to get on here. Okay. So most of you know where Crystal Cove State Park is. If anybody is here who doesn't come from, who's listening in, it's not from the Orange County area. This is between Laguna Beach and Newport Beach. And that's about, I think it's 3,000 or 4,000 acre park. It was set up in 1979. It currently gets about, well, not this year, but in other years, it gets about 2 million visitors a year. And so you would think with that kind of a visitor load, it would be a very, very well-studied park. Well, for all the visits that the state parks get, stuff, one of the things they don't usually get is a whole lot of research money. And so I was somewhat surprised in 2017 to learn that they never have had a baseline rare plant survey done for the park. I was actually hired to do about 1,000 acres of land, but ended up doing it a little differently than they planned. So this is definitely one of those places in Orange County where the beach and the surf get together, the people are there, and you've got some beautiful habitat such. If you're not familiar with the area, this is the basic layout for Crystal Cove. It's got a large interior section, which centers on a canyon named Morrow Canyon. And then you've got sort of a coastal bluff section, which is only about 400 acres or so. The original survey I was looking at was trying to do 1,000 acres. I ended up really concentrating on that 400 acres and just doing a little bit of tiptoeing out into that interior section. There was just so much to be seen on that coastal section. So we were basically I was basically looking for rare plants and sensitive species. And I was also targeting invasive species, although I only had to go after invasive species if they were away from the trail. There was another crew that was actually doing surveys that was right on the trail. And then update and expand the species list. So those were the things I started out with this project to do. Of course, the other thing that was exciting this year was I had already been doing a 2,500 acre project for the Irvine Ranch Conservancy up in the Sea of Irvine. So it got to be a very, very busy year. We didn't actually start until the end of March on this particular survey. So here's some of the things I found during this looking out there in spring and summer of 2017. 17 species of rare plants. 6 of those were 1B taxa, that's our highest rank, basically endangered, rare and endangered in California. And then one was a CRPR3 taxon, that was the Hordeum intercedens. I think it's still a 3, but they keep thinking of moving it around a little bit. And then there were 10 taxa that were of rank 4, which is pretty impressive. And additionally, there were 4 other locally rare species in Orange County that we recorded on this particular project. Also added that list, about 300 species of plants were observed. About almost 200 of them were natives, about 120 or so were non-natives. And I also put together a nice little list compiling all the other sources for plant lists for the park, and came up with about 400 taxa total. So it's a very diverse place. It's got a little bit more non-native diversity than we'd like to see, but anybody's familiar with the park will know, particularly the mesas have had a sort of a checkered past. Many of the mesas on the West of Coast Highway have been tilled at one point or another. In the Second World War, right before the Second World War, there were Japanese American farmers who were working those fields, and a lot of the mesas were quite disturbed and never really recovered. Today, if you go out to Crystal Cove, it's a testament to the folks who've been doing habitat restoration that in some ways it looks like natural habitat up on the mesa, but really you have to look at the ravines and the cliff sides to get the habitat that's not really disturbed there. So in context, I threw this little slide together just to show where Crystal Cove stood in things in Orange County. There's a number of other studies I've been working on over the years. There's the Dana Point Headlands, it's got about 60 acres. Buck Gully had about 300 acres. You know, my little pictures are actually blocking my numbers up there. I didn't know about that. See if I can make it even smaller. Hang on just a second. I try to do this. Having a little cursor issues here. Well, that's not what I want to do. Okay. Well, I won't actually know numbers. I'll have to guess them some days. Okay, so Crystal Cove, they really looked at seriously was about 450 acres of habitat, maybe 500 or 600 if you throw in what I did with binoculars and stuff. Donald Neal Land Conservancy, I did with Dave Bramlett many years ago, about 1,200 acres. And then finally, the San Diego Burn had 11,000 acres. If you look at the number on the far right, it tells you how many species we're seeing in these different places. And you can see Crystal Cove is pretty high. It's about 18 species or 17. Can't quite see my number because it's hiding behind little screens. If you compare that to the larger areas, you know, San Diego Burn is huge compared to Crystal Cove, and it still had more species. The Dana Point Headlands is the only comparable place. So what does this tell us? It tells us that those areas on the immediate coast are really important sites. And this is on the Dana Point Headland ones. There's actually the number I've got in the little box. That tells you how many rare plant sites were actually found, not the diversity. So for example, we did find a lot of rare plant sites on the San Diego Burn, about 470. The Dana Point one has red bars because those are species that are no longer there thanks to a not so well planned out restoration there. Almost all those were 1B species too. I decided for this program, it might be kind of fun to divide it into 4 different areas and kind of go geographically, sort of kind of look at one area and some of the species there and then move on to the next. And so that's how we're doing this. We're going to start at the south end of the park, basically down on the beach and on the coastal bluffs. As I said, most of the front study I actually did here was really centered on those coastal bluffs. It was one of the most wonderful offices you could ever have. The south end is actually, if you've been to Dana Point, this looks like it could be a picture taken down at Dana Point. It has a very similar construct, a headland at the south end. The one thing that's kind of interesting about the one here is Joan Irvine has a house at the top of this one. It's kind of a nice place to live, I'm sure. And I've always wondered what's on that little hill that's behind the thing, behind the house. In Dana Point, there's all kinds of really interesting things here. But this is private property, so we never know. So at the south end, what I was really looking at here was the coastal bluff areas. And there was some pretty interesting things here. One of them is the little saltbush on the beach here. This is the only saltbush I found of this particular species during the entire study. This is Atroplex leucophila. It's beach saltbush. It was last collected, at least in 2017, when I was looking during the project, it was last collected in 1946 in Orange County. We know it's around, and it's definitely in surrounding areas, but it's not doing particularly well in Southern California. It turns out that the beach culture is a little hard on beach plants. So it was very exciting to see this plant and get a sample of it for the first time. Of course, I took a CNPS field trip out the very next year, and we found more of it, but outside the study. But that's a very, I remember this when I was in college, basically, that it was a little easier to find back then. Here's another interesting plant that was found on this study. It's, one of the things I took advantage of, which you couldn't have done too many years earlier, was that while I'm doing my surveying work and going out and looking, it's an open public park. So other people are going out at the same time, and they're doing their own little thing. And many of you know James Bailey. He's out, of course, poking around, finding things all the time. It gets a little overzealous occasionally with names sometimes, but most of the time he comes up with some pretty interesting things. He ran into a population of Philostoma aeratum. Ramosissimum, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. Philostoma ramosissimum and San Diego Fiesta sunflower, or Fiesta flower. And what's interesting about that is it's largely a San Diego species. And I believe there's a couple locations in Riverside, but there's never been any populations found in Orange before. So that was kind of fun to find that. Well, he, of course, passed the word on to Ron Vanderhoff. Ron Vanderhoff went down and looked at it and posted on, I think he posted on CalFlora. And then I ran into it and called Ron Vanderhoff, found out that James actually found it. And they went down and actually got a sample of it. On the picture on the right, you can see that these two flowers are actually the one that we have commonly in Orange County, which is Philostoma auratum, often associated with oak stands. Well, we had some of it right here growing with this. You can see the very, very distinct difference in the flower size on these two things. I get pretty excited when we get plants that are added to the county that are native. We can get weeds all the time that nobody's before recorded. But it's not often that we get interesting little natives popping in that haven't been recorded in the county before. So that's a nice little way to start the survey out. If any of you have attended to our Orange County Botany Forum meetings, you've already heard some of the stories about this plant. We have for years called this Phacelis greenii or Phacelis crassifolia forma greenii. Sometimes called San Diego ground cherry. It's a appears to be a plant that actually likes a little bit more summer and fall rainfall. And so like in 2015, it started popping up in a lot of places in the county after we'd had almost an inch and a half of rain in September. I had seen it back in the 1980s and pretty much didn't see it again until 2015. So it's not a real common plant in Orange County. But the bigger problem we had, and this was true of the San Diego people also, is what the heck name do we put on this thing? And apparently Mike Simpson helped track down that it may not be a crassifolia or greenii type thing at all, but something called Phacelis heterofolia, which is actually a Mojave Desert plant in the southwestern US plant. And overall, it shares some similar characters, but if anyone knows the desert rat, Jim Andre, who knows just about every plant that's out in the Mojave Desert, I showed him a photograph of this and he agreed it's heterofolia, but he'd never seen heterofolia form this dense bushy look to it. So he's kind of intrigued by the whole thing. So probably this is going to end up being some sort of undescribed variety of Phacelis heterofolia. For now, we're treating it as a Orange County locally rare species. It has no special criteria or protections. And I suspect that it's going to largely fade away if we don't get more summer rain again. We did find it this not this year, but last year in Woods Canyon. But we found it something like at 9 or 10 new places in 2015, just one during this study down at the south end of Crystal Cove. Another little interesting issue going on at the south end of Crystal Cove is what Dudley is that? For years, there's been people talking about Dudleya cespitosa occurs down there, particularly on the cliffs below the Joan Irvine house. And other people have saying that they disputed whether cespitosa actually gets to Orange County. There's also reports for it at Newport Back Bay. But most of these reports are pretty old. Even the Marsh collection would have been in the 1980s, which is 30 years ago now. And we periodically go down and find the plants down at Crystal Cove. And I looked at them this year. There are some characteristics that suggest that they could be Dudleya cespitosa, but there's also plenty of plants down there that look like they're plain old Lanceolata. So during 2017, my conclusion was they're probably Lanceolata, but have a little bit of Dudleya cespitosa in them. But this particular photograph looks more like Dudleya cespitosa than some of the other ones do. But what's missing in this is you don't see any kind of a real stalk coming up on this plant. True cespitosa is going to have almost like a little wooden pedestal on it, and there'll be some space between the leaves. So the color is right, and the density, the length of the flowers or the bracts on the stem are actually pretty good. So maybe this is Dudleya cespitosa, and we just need to look at it a little bit more. But there is a little of this form of Dudleya at the south end of the park. Well, moving on to the interior section, this is an area I did not spend a whole lot of time in. At least earlier in the year, I actually went back in the fall and spent a little bit more time in there. Morro Canyon sort of dominates the interior section entirely. That's the photograph on the left. You can see there, a little bit hazy there. And Morro Canyon Road going up, there's always hikers on it. I was lucky compared to other people. Of course, I was kind of on the job, but I actually got to drive in. That's really cool to drive in and get to some of those higher places without having to wear yourself out, particularly since it was a hot spring and there was all these hot, sweaty people trying to get up the hill. It felt nice to sit there in my air-conditioned car or 4Runner. The slopes, mostly coastal sage scrub, and they're relatively steep, but if you get up on top, it's fairly flat. There's lots of sandstone exposures. There's lots of potential for some really interesting stuff up there. It's one of the few places in the county you can reliably find pine golden bush, Ericameria pinifolia. However, due to how many plants were down on the coastal bluffs, I just didn't spend that much time up there. There's a bunch of rare plants that I'm not really going to say much about. You can see and admire the pictures for a moment that were in the interior section. Calcordis, intermediate Mariposa lily, Catalina Mariposa lily, a little bit of prostrate spine flower, Palmer's grappling hook. There's one southwestern spiny rush near the mouth of the canyon, and I suspect it was a recent addition to things. It probably got there natively, naturally, but it's just a little plant. One of the plants that's in there, today we kind of downplay this one. Maybe it's not that exciting anymore in the San Joaquin Hills. If you were in Rancho Mission Viejo, anybody who surveyed Rancho Mission Viejo for rare plants would usually just sort of sigh when they ran into this because there's tons of it in Mission Viejo or Rancho Mission Viejo. But the San Joaquin Hills for years, this plant, Denandra paniculata San Diego tar plant, was known primarily from east of Laguna Canyon Road. Part of that was not a whole lot of people looking, I guess, or recognizing it west of the road. There were certainly botanists out working on the west side in the 1980s. At Harmsworth doing a lot of work and other ones working the whole way. But generally, you don't hear much about this plant. But as the years have gone by, recently we've been doing surveys in the western part, Palmer Canyon, Shady Canyon, parts of Newport, and we're picking this plant up all the way to the west end of the San Joaquin Hills. At the higher elevations in Crystal Cove, there's a fair amount of it. Nothing like you'd find in southern, in Rancho Mission Viejo, or you'd find over in southwestern Riverside County, but a fair amount of that. It's one of our few tar plants that has 8 ligule, so it makes it fairly recognizable. And it's got kind of a sticky, you can almost see the hairs and glands pretty easily on this one. It's a fairly late bloomer. It usually doesn't start reblooming until May or maybe even June sometimes. And then it blooms right on to October and sometimes even November. But it's just interesting. It just added to our additional information that this plant was more widespread in the San Joaquin Hills than we thought. This was one of my personal favorites for Crystal Cove State Park. This is a Quercus lobata by Quercus berberifolia hybrid, valley oak hybrid. If you were here in 1980, though, you would have thought it was McDonald's oak, because that's what they called these things. And then they weren't sure what to do with these hybrids back then. There's a tree, it's about 40 feet high, so it's a pretty good tree. It's got some pretty darn deep leaves. But you did, if anybody's familiar with oaks, you can see the map down below showing about where the dot is. If you're familiar with the oaks, though, you know that Quercus lobata is actually a deciduous oak and loses all its trees in the winter, or loses all its leaves in the winter. This one was collected on January 30th, 1983, and the company with Kelly Steele, one back of real knowledgeable oak people back in the day. It's fully leaved. So it's not really true Quercus lobata, because even though it's a tree, even though it's got really deep lobes on the leaves, it's not deciduous. So it's got some Quercus berberifolia in it. There were a number of other individuals nearby. Two of them were flanking it that were relatively tall and a little bit less lobe, and others nearby that looked much more like regular scrub oaks that were probably also hybridized. Now, unfortunately, in 1993, the Laguna fire came through. That's the red that's down on the map below. It was relatively large, and I think it was centered on this oak. No, not quite. But it did burn through there, and it took me many years to get back in there. I've had other people tell me they were still around. But apparently in 1994, we had a fair amount of water, and it was a flood, and it actually took out the bench that had this tree on it. This tree is totally gone now. However, one of the other individuals that was large has survived, and that's this one. It's kind of beat up. You can actually still see some of the fire scoring on it from 1993, and but it's got relatively large leaves, and not all of them, but some of the leaves have some pretty deep lobes on it. So pretty strongly ending up with a pretty strong influence of valley oak in there. Interestingly enough, there's a couple scrub oaks growing next to it that clearly that must be integrating with this. They have larger leaves and maybe slightly larger acorns, almost certainly mixed up with berberifolia. But the algorithms in the California Consortium of Herbarium have all labeled them Quercus acutidens, which is an Engelmannii by Cornelius Mulleri hybrid. Well, that's obviously not the case when you got lobata growing right next to that thing. They had a little problem with that. Acutidens gets all over the place. Even Kevin Nixon identified one of the hybrids here as acutidens, but he was unaware, apparently, that lobata was growing next to it, which would be the more likely source for the second pair. So moving into the central section of this, I'll call this the Central Cliffs region. We're back down on the bluffs. And I didn't spend too much time here either, because it's really got a relatively narrow bench on top, and the slopes are quite steep. For example, here's one spot where I was standing over trying to see, how am I going to map the Aphanisma blightoides down there? That's the red you see in this photograph. It's down on the cliff about 40 or 50 feet. It's really steep, and it's another 100 feet down and almost another 100 feet farther below. I didn't particularly feel like accidentally rolling down to the bottom, so I pretty much stayed off the cliffs in these areas. It's the one area of Crystal Cove where you get these relatively serious cliffs. Most of Crystal Cove is actually a relatively docile 40 or so foot high cliffs, where it's not that big a deal if you happen to roll off one of them. But also, it's a little bit, for people who have trouble with vertigo, the 40 foot isn't really that big a deal, but 120, you really can see it. It starts getting a little bit lower as you get a bit farther north. But the other thing in this section is there's a lot less vegetation. Between the steep slopes, you probably get a lot more erosion going on, a little bit less of the vegetation taking to the thing. But you still have a thin coastal bluff scrub here. One of the rare plants one of the few rare plants that's really common in this particular section, it's even more common farther north, is Aphanisma blightoides. Another sort of an interesting rare plant. For 1995, we knew one location in Newport Back Bay that Bob D. Ruff found. And that was it for years. And then we found it in 2008 down at the Dana Point Headlands. We're pretty excited about the thing. And it turns out the thing is a weed at Crystal Cove. There is a lot of it there. As an example, on the photograph on the right, all that tangled mess of the sort of orange there is the Aphanisma. Of course, go in and try to count that. I talked to some of my associates down in San Diego who are on Point Loma trying to count this at the same time I was. And we're all scratching our heads at how to best do it. The plant actually starts out with this nice sort of lime green when it's young. In the picture on the upper left, you can see the standard color for this. And then as the season goes on, it turns to orange and then sort of into a red color. It's really kind of a very dramatic plant. It's not up every year. One of the folks that did surveys on Dana Point Headlands as a follow-up, I think in probably the same year, 2017, didn't find that much on the Dana Point Headlands, where I found quite a bit more of it back in 2008 and 2010. So this is another interesting, I apologize. One of the things you may notice that I get kind of excited about some of these obscure little green plants that look like a weed that's growing in your front yard. I'm sorry about that, but there's some really interesting little obscure plants that are like that. This is called Atriplex davidsonii, although if you look in Jepson, they officially call it Atriplex serenana variation davidsonii. If you know Atriplex serenana, you know the two really aren't all that similar. Not only are they completely structured differently, the one smells really strong and this one doesn't have much of a smell at all. They're two different species, certainly. It originally was described as Atriplex davidsonii by Stanley way back in 1917 or so, and I'm sticking with that name. This is a CPR1B species, and it has a 2 listed, suggesting it's not all that rare. But I guess that's because they found it on the Channel Islands. I'm not convinced yet they haven't just all sampled the same population many a time, but it's not common on the mainland. We had a number of records, particularly in Orange County back in the 1930s. And that was it for a long time. We've been looking for this thing for a long time in Orange County, and we could never find it. It's been 85 years since it's been collected in either Los Angeles County or on the mainland, or in Orange County, or, well, I don't think it really occurs in San Diego County. So it's been a long time seeing. I originally had found it earlier in the March before it was spitting out fruits, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. But I found it in this section in June and almost instantly realized what I had. Notice that it's got sort of a yellowish, almost yellow-orange, fairly robust stem on the central plant. That's a pretty strong characteristic. The other thing is it's got some real clustering of the bracts, the fruits that are on this. Turns out that the plant actually occurs out at Hemet as well. We've known for years that Atriplex davidsonii is out there. We assumed it was probably something new, and now we know it's actually the same thing, but they're probably 2 different varieties, because the interior stuff is a little different than the stuff on the coast. It's pretty rare too. It's much rarer than several of the endangered species out there. And you can see the habitat, typical habitat for this plant growing on the left. The plant sort of in the middle, sort of a clayish sort of mound. We also find it on the actual steep slope itself. I get the middle picture. I had to clamber up a slope about that was almost vertical. I could only get close enough to get my camera close to the thing and shoot a picture. So the northern bluff section was probably the richest area out there. And it's where I spent most of my time. There's the historical district, kind of the buildings off to the right. A lot of that actually was rescued, has been saved since the days when it was a small vacation community with a small Japanese American population and a little religious center for the local farmers and such. And from there on, a series of coastal bluffs goes all the way to the north end of the park. And it's a little bit more vegetated in this section. Here's kind of a clever picture. In the morning, I came down to this cliff and you look down and it was low tide and it was foggy, so you couldn't see a whole lot. If you look at the second picture on the right, that's when I was coming back for the day. It's the same spot pretty much, a little different angle, but you can recognize some of the vegetation clumps and the shape of the bluff formations. A little different looking in the middle when it's got sunny weather. This is the Pelican Point area, which is on the north end of the park. That's always been a famous spot for various plants. Pelican Point has been, people were making notes on maps for plants, rare ones and otherwise, for years at this point. And the very north end of the park tends to be the most rugged, actually. Some very rugged rock formations in some of the coves there. And it's a little bit more vegetated at the north end. Most of what we're seeing there is actually Rhus integrifolia, lemonade berry, which is in Orange County a pretty big component of something of coastal bluff scrub. This is one of the areas where it was taking me so long to survey, because this ridge right here in front of you, there's 5 species of rare plants in that photograph. And in Orange County, that's pretty unusual. We often see 1 or 2 species growing in proximity to each other. Now, if you're in San Diego County, that's no big deal, because there, you step out of your car and there's 7 rare plants to be seen. But in Orange County, it's pretty unusual. And it can take a while. So if you're doing surveys on this sort of thing, you'll end up spending 2 hours on one ridge sometimes. But the primary one that's on this ridge that you can't really see here is many-stemmed Dudleya multicaulis. But there are other ones as well. Aphanisma, I just mentioned, that's also here in the north end. There's quite a bit of it. There's a patch of it that's early growing state, the bright green in the very middle, just getting a little bit of orange on it, pretty much up and down the entire bluff. Some at the very top, but most of it on the bluff slope or near the beach. There's a couple other rare plants that we ran into up here. I'm not really going to talk to you a whole lot. Small flowered Microceros, a little bit of that on the sleeve, and then there's red sand verbena, which is really mostly at the north end of the park with a few scattered plants growing right on the beach at the south end. Very pretty plant, but I've already got enough to talk about, so I'm not going to bring up more. Bob did remind me I have time limits. Okay, so 2 plants that aren't necessarily particularly special rare plants, but they were kind of a big thing for me on this survey. That's the Lycium californicum, the California boxthorn, which is these are both coastal bluff scrub indicator species. The boxthorn often best seen growing right at the edge of the bluffs, and on the one on the right, woolly sea blight was more likely to be actually on the bluff slopes or in the beach margin. If you look at the map below, I just want to show you how much of this stuff there was. The scale of this is so that, pretty small, but you can see there's lots of orange and blue polygons down there along the beach. All those are different map units for these 2 species. There was a lot of it. Mostly I just mapped it on a field map and then later on digitized it. So it would take me too long to do actual GPS stuff. Oh, there's a point for each one of those populations anyway. But there was a lot. It kept me very entertained for a lot of the survey. In fact, I actually came out later in the year because unlike a lot of the other plants, these 2 you can survey almost any time of year. You don't really have to have them in bloom or flower to figure out what they are. Most of the other ones, you really do have to be out there in March, April, and May to get them. If you look at the old information for rare plants on the bluff tops or the margins of it, most of them will tell you that Atropix specific saltbush is the main saltbush that's over at Crystal Cove State Park. That's a relative thing. Maine, there's not a whole lot of it. The old ones records, it was like 5 or 6 sites. But in fact, it is Coulter saltbush that's the really common rare saltbush that's there. Every single mesa north of the historic district has on it. It's a small perennial. In some cases, the whole plant is generally about half a dime high, and it might be spreading in some cases just over a few inches of ground, other times a little bit longer. It's got a fan-shaped bract, you can see in the lower picture, with often 5 to 6 different, 5 to 7 teeth on it. And it's a very distinctive little plant. Once you get to know it, unfortunately, there's like I said, Davidsonii can look similar to it. And when I first ran into Davidsonii, I was thinking, it's not this, but what is it? And then Pacifica can look very much like it also. So if you're not familiar with these salt bushes, they're actually kind of a pain in the neck to sort out. But once you get to know them, they're pretty easy. Even in the worst years, I did one of the CMPS field trips on an awful, terrible spring, and we still managed to find this stuff. I don't think any of them were more than an inch across, but it was there. I think we got a total of, just a second. Call try. 57 different populations or sites found at Crystal Cove State Park. And that was compared to about 6 that were known prior to that. Or actually, I'm not even sure Atriplex culturae was on the original list because they've identified it with this. This is Atriplex pacifica, South Coast salt bush. It's another 1B plant. And it's a little bushier, at least in Orange County, than the other one. It has very tiny bracts. You can see that penny sitting there, and there's the little tiny bract against it. It only has 3 prongs. So it's got 1 strong central tooth and 2 weak teeth on the side versus about twice that many teeth to 3 times that many teeth for culturae. And a culturae bract is about almost 3 times larger as well. This was a really rare plant at Crystal Cove State Park. You can see the habitat on the left. Basically, it grows up on these in the open areas on the coastal bluffs. And it's got this kind of bushy and it's got red stems like culturae, but a little different leaf, a little bit more teethy. The plant overall is more bushy. There was a grand total of 4 sites. So it wasn't very common. There was a couple of sites we could theoretically have found that someone else had reported, but these are annuals. So if someone reported it 20 years ago, there's no guarantee it's still around in the same place. Here's a couple of these salt bushes all next to each other. I have in the middle, Pacific salt bush one I just showed. You can again see that. You can just see the little tiny bracts on that. And the cultured salt bush on the left, it's got much larger bracts, a bit more distinctive. They both got red stems. The leaves are a little different culturae, but they kind of overlap. There's even one place where they occurred on the same little patch of clay. But to compare that, one of the confusions you've got when you're looking for these things for a rare plant, you're surveying them, is that the really common and weedy Australian salt bush, Atriplex semibaccata, which is doing just fine at Crystal Cove State Park, can look an awful lot like it. However, one thing that you can tell at the very top of the photograph for the semibaccata, you can see that there's these sort of inflated red bracts that look almost like little balls. That's something the other 2 don't have, and that's a dead giveaway that the other one is not one of our native ones. There are actually, I think, 4 other salt bushes occurring at Crystal Cove State Park. And one of them, Atriplex glauca, is pretty darn distinctive, but I found that when they first start and they're a little bit runty, in other words, they're not growing very well, they're stinted, they can look a lot like culturae also. But that's mostly at the very north end and down on the beach pretty much is where you'll find Atriplex glauca. That, by the way, is a species that has only reached Orange County. I think we first found it in the 1980s. I don't think it was here before that. Then, of course, many stem Dudleya, always fun to look at. And when it's full bloom, a very beautiful little Dudleya. This is one of those unusual Dudleyas where it actually originates from a corm, and then it grows up in the spring, puts its flowers out, loses its leaves, and disappears after once it dries out, and it's gone again. So if you come back and look for it in the summer, you usually can't find anything but maybe a dried flowering stalk, where most of our leftovers have leaves that pretty much hang around most of the year. Some of them will get pretty wilted in the dry season, but you still have a rosette of leaves for it. There's only a handful of species. This particular group is the Hesianthus group, which at one point was actually considered a separate genus. This is on like 1 every 3 ridges on the north side of the thing. There were a couple really nice stands of this stuff where many square feet of yellow flowers. I meant to stick a picture of Riley Pratt standing in one of them. Riley Pratt was the guy that got me, worked for IRC, that got me working on this. And then he was so enamored with Crystal Cove that he jumped ship and ended up working for the state park system shortly after I finished this project. Now, here's another little challenge you've got when you're surveying for this plant. Plant on the left is Dudley multicaulis. The plant on the right is Mesobranthan nodiflorum, a small flowered ice plant, a nasty weed we don't want. They can actually look pretty similar. Now they look pretty different here if you're staying and just looking at this, one's smooth, one's not and stuff. But if you're 4.5 feet over the ground, these things take a little looking. And if you've got the Dudley growing in stands of the small flowered ice plant, it's pretty challenging to find them sometimes. There's an unusual plant for Orange County. I mean, it's been on the list for a long time. There are collections from the city of Laguna Beach from the 1920s. But pretty much after the 1920s, nobody found it, or at least nobody recorded it. And it just sort of faded away. We found it at Dana Point Headlands in 2008. And yeah, here was a little bit of it here up at Crystal Cove State Park as well. Not a lot. In fact, it looks like it was just 3 sites. But there were pretty good sized plants here compared to what we had at Dana Point. The tallest plant we had at Dana Point was 6 inches tall. The tallest one we had here was 1.5 feet high. This is a fairly common plant down in San Diego County in Baja California, but it's pretty much, with the exception, I think there's one location in Los Angeles County, I can't recall, and I think it's on some of the Channel Islands, but we're about at the very, very north end of its range. This is a relative of miner's lettuce. You know, and sorry about that. I just realized that the name is boilerplated on there. Sorry, that is seaside something. Seaside daisy? No, seaside Cistanthia. Okay, great name for it. Okay. Then rare grasses, we don't have many rare grasses. And this has always been obscure grass across Southern California for years. Dave Bramlett was always pursuing this grass relentlessly, trying to sort out what's going on with it. Never found it anywhere particularly common, just scattered around in more mesic native or mesic grasslands, except for out at Hemet, where the things forms entire fields of this stuff. Well, it used to be, now they're almost all gone. But Crystal Cove was a good spot for this plant. We found a lot of it right there on the edge of the bluff. There's more of this plant growing in Crystal Cove than pretty much anywhere in Orange County. There was a brief time where, just looking at the number here. There was a brief time where Dana Point Headlands had a lot larger population, about 5,000 plants, but it's an annual, so you can get a lot of plants in a small area. And stuff at Dana Point was growing because it was irrigated as part of the restoration. After the irrigation went away, so did this plant. It's much harder to find again. But I found around 1,500 plants here. So that's a pretty good number. Yet it looks like about 35 different sites. Okay. Some of you know of our little complication with this one. At one point, this was considered a really rare plant. It got as long as it almost got listed by the state as a state-listed rare endangered plant. And then James Ravel came out and decided he didn't think it was a really good valid subspecies and got kind of thrown out. But it still bothers me to this day because it's a pretty different looking Turkish rugging if you know the interior stuff. You know, Bob and I did put this in the Wildflower book as Orange County Turkish rugging. It's still a little bit undecided yet. It doesn't have official status with the Jepson manual or anything like that. But it's a very distinctive plant, and it's pretty much found only on the coastal slope of the San Joaquin Hills. Pretty much today, almost all exclusively in Crystal Cove State Park. It's a pretty big, robust plant compared to this stuff, the narrow stuff you find in the interior. There's a different form of it. It used to be a different variety or different subspecies. They called it at one point this color. That's kind of intermediate between this and the interior stuff. And it's mostly like down in Temple Hill and the Gell Hill area of Orange County and then in San Diego County. And so there's some debate still with this, whether this really is something distinct or it's just sort of in between thing. I know it's not just an ecological variation because I tried growing some once before the Museum of Systematic Biology shut down. And it was definitely growing differently than interior stuff, but that's as far as I ever got with it. When you get at Crystal Cove, there's some places where it just covers the mesa right next to the historic district. And pretty interesting one, it's got those green puffballs of flowers, but really beautiful when it's got the pink. This was one I was really excited about finding nests. This was This is Euphorbia misra, cliffsbird. I only found one plant, and I came back and even showed various people this plant because I was so excited about it. There's some natural populations up at Corona del Mar that were largely impacted by a sidewalk project or a walkway project. And so it's nice to find it here. Unfortunately, after all of this dust settled and I got all excited about this, Dave Pryor, some of you may know him, who used to work for State Parks. Hey, by the way, that was Chianti. I forgot to introduce her earlier. She's always got to get involved in these things somewhere online. Anyway, so Dave Pryor basically said, oh, well, I think we planted that one just to see what would happen. So evidently it's actually not native to the park, even though the habitat is right. It currently is not spreading, so apparently it's not happy with the habitat because he's planted it quite a while and it's still sitting there. You don't necessarily get established well if you just stay one plant and never expand. There's another one there that has a little of the same problem. It's a little bit more obvious. That's San Diego sunflower. There's one individual I found on one of the mesas there. It's actually growing at the edge of an area that was restored a little bit. And we know this plant is wildly crazy about spreading when it gets the opportunity. There are several places in Orange County where we knew it only had one or two individuals when it was discovered, and now particularly one near Silverado now covers 40 acres. So it's a very happy little plant, and it's spreading northward, and it comes up the freeways and stuff. So it's not going to stay put. So, but it's a rare plant. What do we do with it? Actually, I think it's a CRPR 4.2, but I'm just running this together. Oh, look at that. I guess that's the same thing that we're about in the end here. Okay. I wasn't going to say anything about this plant, but I'll say it anyway. This is a, oh no, I forgot. Spurgularia macrotheca, and it starts with an L. Sorry, I can't remember the subspecies. I suddenly forgot. But that's why I actually write the names down on these, so I can actually remember them. Anyway, it's another plant that is very, very scarce in Orange County, and only been found in a couple different places. We found on one side of it at Crystal, and I think that is the bulk of my program here. So just to wrap up, this is just a delightful place to poke around botany. Unfortunately, most of you are not allowed to go wandering off the trails, so you don't get to quite enjoy it the way I did. But this is one of the advantages you get when you get paid to do a job. You get to go into all kinds of places. I did have to wear orange vest almost every day, but it was still well worth it. I'll sort of leave it off with this beautiful shot here of Orange County Turkish rugging on one of the little flat mesas there. And that's pretty much it. Pippin sitting in a field of flowers. So I think originally we were going to have questions scattered through the program, but I didn't hear anybody say anything. So I think we've got them all stuck at the end here again. Okay.
Well, I don't see any questions in the chat. There have been a couple of comments here and there, and a few of us have been writing back and forth, but nothing that needed to come from you, Fred.
Okay.
How many acres was your survey again?
I was actually surveying overall 1,000 acres, but really only about 450 acres of it I actually surveyed.
Wow. Wow. And often you said we. Did someone work with you, or are you using imperial?
No, I wasn't really working with other people. It's just I have to refer to we when I was working with Irvine Ranch Conservancy or whatever, kind of like the groups I'm working with rather than individuals. Mm-hmm. Well, I do have had a lot of surveys recently where it's like Sandy and I doing it. So it's more often nowadays there's two people.
Right, right. Well, Fred, thank you very much. I can attest to how beautiful that place is. I've seen a lot of the places that he surveyed, and I saw many of those plants, not the salt bushes, but
their best part.
Apparently, you're the only one I know that can go, I'm not going to talk about that nice Mariposa lily.
Yeah.
But
I was going to talk a little bit about Mariposa lilies, but it looks like I've been doing that an awful lot lately. So
yeah, that's true, you do. Okay, did you find Salvia spethacea?
No. If spethacea is there, it would be on the interior side, I'm pretty sure.
Right. Well, Sarah Jane asked that. And as you know, Sarah Jane many years ago did a flora for Casper's Park.
1990, as a matter of fact.
Crystal Cove State Park, excuse me. Yeah. And it sounds like she may have found it back then. And it sure would be nice to re-find it, because that's would
I
be,
have a list of all her plants right here. And yes, it says Salvia spathicea on it. It was, yeah, it's in her 1990 thing. Actually, I talked to Sarah about it in October 2017, according to these notes, and it was current in association with Oak Woodlands in Morrow Canyon.
okay, well, that would be good to relocate that if we could.
Yeah.
That's a wild record. Okay, well, everyone's saying thank you, Fred, and I am
Okay.
too. Thank you, Fred, and good night, everybody. Thanks for coming. Sorry about